In the last video, we looked at game 1 of the 1984 World Championship between Karpov and Kasparov, and that was a draw. And well, Karpov did had some initiative in that game, but Kasparov defended well. And before this game, he was feeling quite optimistic about this game, and he was in a mood to fight. He was in the mood to engage the world champion in a full-fledged battle. And this game is really crazy for a world championship game. Kasparov, right from the beginning, sacrificed a pawn and went directly for Black's king. So let's have a look at this game. Kasparov started the game with d4. So knight f6, c4, e6. Kasparov played knight to f3. So there can be various options. Karpov can continue with d5. Queens. We have the queen's gambit. He can also play b6, which was played in the game. So b6 is the queen's Indian defense. And now white plays g3. Of course, Kasparov's favorite was of course to play knight c3 and after bishop e7 or bishop e7 simply to continue with a3, and this was Kasparov's favorite variation in this particular position. But in this game, they have prepared for g3, bishop b7, bishop g2. So as you can see, both the players have fianchetted the bishops, and Black's control. Black would like to play very much on the light square, whereas white has an interesting idea prepared for black here. So let's have a look at that. So bishop e7, castles, castles, and this is the position where Kasparov went for the black king with d5. This is the pawn sacrifice. It's a very powerful pawn sacrifice. So this was taken. What's the idea behind this? Why do we sacrifice a pawn right in the center? We know that center pawns are super important. The idea is, whereas black will have to waste time capturing that pawn, white on the other hand will mobilize his pieces and take them all to the king side and launch an attack on the black king. So now white plays knight h4. So opening up the bishop and pinning the pawn over here. This cannot be captured because the bishop on b7 is hanging. So also at the same time, the knight on h4 can actually jump to the f5 square, and the f5 square, as we all know, is an incredibly powerful square for the knight. Sometimes Kasparov also called the knight on f5 as knife on f5 because it's so influential and influences a lot of things. He will not only control these dark squares but also look after the g7 square. And in case black wants to push the knight with g6, there will be weaknesses around his king, and that will be exploited by white in the game. So that's why this is quite an aggressive approach by white. Black continues with c6. So just unpinning and probably threatening to take the pawn on c4. So white now has to take this, and after knight takes, you can see the bishop has been opened up and there is an attack on the h4 knight. So what would you do? Let's put a knight on the powerful f5 square. So knight has finally went there. Now white would very much like to play e4 and just shift his pieces on the king side with queen g4, knight f3, and knight c3 and bishop f4 or bishop f6, and this is quite aggressive. So black has to do something immediately. So basically, it's a very principled approach. Whenever your opponent attacks on one of the flanks, you should play right in the center. And Karpov plays in the center. He plays knight to c7, so vacating the d5 square and preparing to push his pawn to d5. And after that, he would very easily be able to get his pieces on the king side in order to defend. So whenever your opponent attacks on the king side or the queen side, you should play in the center. This is what Karpov is doing here. So the knight went back. Now white plays knight to c3, d5 as expected. d5 is played. Black has excellent control over the central squares. There is huge control over the squares. So black has one pawn. Black is a sound pawn up, whereas white has a lot of activity. He would very much like to play e4, shift the queen over here, and get his pieces in the attack as soon as possible. So this is clearly material versus activity. So there are two aspects of chess fighting against each other, and let's see what happens. So white now plays e4, challenging the center, opening up the queen's diagonal, preparing to bring the queen either to g4 or to h5 in certain cases. Pardon me for that. So let's see what happens. Bishop to f6, and Kasparov played bishop to f4. This is a very interesting move, and let me read out one of his comments from his own book, Garry Kasparov on Modern Chess, and let's see what he thinks of this move. So bishop to f4, a move which was prepared specially for the match. Of course, this move is not a novelty, it had been played before, but Kasparov has specially made this line as his prepared variation in the match. So white maintains the tension in the center, retaining his e4 pawn, which may come in useful in the offensive. However, as I placed the knight, as I placed the bishop on f4, I suddenly saw that black had a reply which we had not considered here, and I intuitively sensed that this was what my opponent would play. In fact, Kasparov sensed in this position that there is something very powerful that black can play, which they had not prepared against. So Karpov came up with bishop to c8, an excellent novelty, and in fact, it was Kasparov who was trying to shock and surprise Karpov, but it was Karpov who surprised Kasparov with this novelty. The threat is simply to take the knight, and with this knight gone, White's attack would very much be dismantled, because without this knight, I don't think White has any kind of initiative, and Black whereas has a very powerful grip in the center. So what should White play here? Kasparov spends a lot of time on the board and continues with g4. So this is quite an interesting idea. He cements the knight even more, and he would like to put his bishop back on g3 square, finally preparing to play f2 f4, and as you can see, he would like to continue with e5 f5 and launch a pawn avalanche on black. So that was the idea of this g4 move, just preparing to put the bishop back, and f2 f4. How should black respond here? Black responds very maturely with knight to a6. So this knight, as you can see, strong players never go for either attack or defense directly. They always try to get all the pieces in the center in the game, and only then they achieve their objective. So Karpov realized that with these three pieces locked in over here, he cannot defend this position successfully. He had to get these three pieces in the game, and the bishop is already doing an excellent job over here, and he might as well sacrifice it at some point or exchange it at some point. So he decided, let's develop this knight on b8, and he plays knight b to a6. But as every move has its ups and downs, this move has its downside as well. The c6 pawn, which was earlier defended, is no longer defended, and white now plays rook to c1, kind of eyeing the c6 pawn a little bit, and if possible, maybe at some point we can attack this pawn. So let's see what happens. Karpov plays bishop to d7, and Kasparov plays queen to d2. So finally, it looks like all of white pieces are ready in the game, and he would like to attack with moves like e5, bishop g3, f4, and try to go all in with his attack. Black in the position played knight to c5, and this is a very interesting move. Finally, the knight on b8 has now reached c5 and is threatening to perhaps take over here, and in which way white will have to exchange some pieces, and the white attack will be neutralized. So what should white play here? In fact, white should have simply captured in the center, but in the game he played e5. Now what's the drawback of this move, you might ask? Well, this is a perfectly reasonable move. The only problem is the position we have reached is a very Karpovian type of position. As you can see, there was a tension in the position in the center, and with this move e5, the tension is released, and what will happen is, yes, white still has his attacking chances, but with a close position was something which was very comfortable for a player like Karpov. Karpov was a positional genius, and he can find his way out very easily in a close position, and this is exactly what Kasparov gave him. So this was more of a psychological error rather than a chess error. So now we have knight takes e7. In fact, this was a little uncertainty showed from Kasparov's part. He would have considered bishop g3, f2 e4, f2 to f4, and just knight takes e7. He wanted to play this move in some sequence, but he was not really sure in what sequence he should play, and that's why after spending some time he just decided, okay, let's go with it, and he captured the bishop here. So queen takes, we have bishop to g5, finally preparing to push forward with f2 f4 and getting the attack done. So the queen is attacked. What should he play? He placed the queen on e6. Well, you might ask, what happens if he takes the pawn? Isn't it capturable? In fact, that would have been a mistake. After queen takes f4, there is a simple move, bishop f4, winning the knight on c7 after the queen moves. So that pawn is poisoned, cannot be captured. So Karpov played queen to e6, targeting the g4 pawn. Kasparov defends that with h3, and finally now again preparing to play f4, f5. Looks like white finally has the attack he wanted, and things are heating up here. So queen g6 played. What's the point of this? As I've explained earlier, Karpov is extremely confident in such type of positions and finds a very interesting idea to repel the attack. So Kasparov plays f4 and Karpov answers this with f6. So the bishop is attacked, the pawn is attacked. If the bishop directly moves, then we are going to capture here and dismantle white's king side. So this has to be captured, and after pawn takes, the bishop has to retreat on h4. So what we have here is an incredibly complex position, but if you look at this closely, maybe it is black who has coordinated his pieces in a better way, and in fact maybe his king doesn't look that unsafe. He can put his king on h8 and probably get his rook in the game, either here or on g8 as well. Try to attack this with f5 or h5, both are playable. So it's very complex position, and in fact it's not really sure whose king is safer and whose king is not. So black continues with f5, attacking the king side and basically making this king even more vulnerable. What should white play here? White didn't back down. He was Kasparov. He loves this kind of complications, and rather than even paying attention to this kind of a attack on the king side, he played b4. And this is a very interesting move. Karpov again did not back down. He just took the pawn, sacrificing a piece. Kasparov in the game rejected the piece offer, and captured the pawn back. But let's have a look at what happens if this piece was captured. Well, then Karpov could take here. The threat is of course over here. It's not really a mate threat because the queen is defending, but simply to take here. So there's a pin over there. Kasparov could have continued with rook f2. After takes bishop g4. Black would like to continue with h5, cementing the bishop over here, and then trying to get his piece as soon as possible in the center. In fact, black is completely coordinated. He's very well placed. All of his pieces are beautifully coordinating, and it's not really sure, of course, with this passed pawn, it's not really sure who is better here, but this would have been an incredibly complex position. It was in fact in this position that Kasparov decided not to take the piece, and he just recaptured on g4. In fact, he should have captured the piece. That would have been a better idea, but Kasparov hesitated a little because he has sacrificed already. He was sacrificing right from move number 5 or 6, and he just hesitated here. He should have took it. He should have took the challenge. But anyway, let's look at this now. So Karpov played knight to d3. It's a octopus knight. Yes, it's Karpov having the octopus knight rather than Kasparov in this game. Of course, the most famous game in their championship was when Kasparov had an octopus knight right on the d3 square, and that was an incredibly famous game. We are going to look at that in the future videos, but let's see what happens here. Kasparov knew that his rook is attacked, and he decided, well, this knight is extremely powerful. What if I just sacrifice it? What if I just ignore it and let him take my rook and rather go for black's king? In this position, he played rook to f3. So the complexity level of this position is just increasing and increasing. You can see this pawn is untouchable. You cannot capture it because if queen takes, then there is rook to g3. G file has been opened up, and once the G file opens up, this can turn out very badly, especially when white has two bishop pair, very powerful bishop pair. Everything can happen. So Karpov says, thank you for the exchange, I'll capture it. Kasparov plays f5. It's an incredibly strong move, attacking the queen. This is an intermediate move, of course. The queen is forced back, so queen goes back. Of course, taking this is, as I said, a mistake because of rook g3, and the queen will drop. So because that's a pin. So in the game, of course, it did not take. He went back, and here we go. So Kasparov is a pawn down, is an exchange down with a very complex position. He has these powerful pawns marching towards the black king. He also has the bishop pair, a rook over here, and then queen, which can jump into the action at some point. But black also has material, and if black can coordinate his pieces, he will be all right, even winning this position. So we have a completely unbalanced position at the board. Now rook a to e8. Finally, black gets all of his pieces in the game, and let's see what happens. Can Kasparov attack? Who is going to win? Kasparov's attack or Karpov's beautiful harmony? Let's see. Queen to d2 played. Now d4 is played, making the d5 square available for the knight. The knight can jump in the game. As you can see, Karpov is a very positional player. He likes to bring all of his pieces in the game, and he realized that knight on c7 is not doing particularly much, so he'd very much like to bring it on d5, from which square it can influence the center of the board and dictate the play. So Kasparov played knight to e2. This knight at time can jump over here, even threaten the pawn, and over here perhaps, let's see, it basically has various options, and the knight can reroute itself. Black continued his plan with knight to d5, giving the pawn back, but getting the knight in the game right in the center of the board, and that's a very powerful knight. So Kasparov takes the pawn, king to h8. This is a prophylactic move. Kasparov calls this as an unnecessary prophylactic move, but at the same time he says that this kind of a move, it's not really easy for black to play in this position. As you can see, black does not have the bishop pair. It's white who has the bishop pair, and this pawns makes life tough for black. So it's not easy to choose a move for black in this position. So king h8. Why was this played? Well, basically, whenever black was threatening to take the pawn, there was rook g3, and now after placing the king on h8, maybe black can threaten the pawn. So what should he play? White plays g5. You can see the pawn was attacked from the queen, so he just pushed forward. So again, Kasparov is threatening to attack, whereas black has a material advantage and also very well placed and coordinating pieces. Now rook to e4, attacking the bishop. Black gets another of his piece in the game, so bishop to f4, just defending, and now queen to e5. I really like Karpov's position, to be honest. I do feel that Kasparov's attack is strong, but Karpov's position give a very powerful impression. They are just very beautifully placed, and it's Karpov at his best. So rook to g3 played. In fact, white is threatening to either play g6 or f6. Probably the stronger idea would be to continue with g6 and then getting the queen on h6, and there can be threats over here and over here, so anything can happen. Rook to f4 played. So there is a lot of firepower against this pawn on f5. White has to do something or his pawns will drop. In the game he played f6. It's a very interesting idea, but at the same time these pawns are fixed and these squares can be blockaded. So Karpov in the game played bishop to e8. Yes, he would like to blockade it, either bring his bishop on g6 or on f7 and blockade the pawn, stop the pawn once and for all, and once the pawns are stopped, white's attack will slow down. So we have d5, a very interesting idea. Kasparov is just going for it. Basically, if you take this, the knight over here will be undermined. For example, capture, this would be a serious mistake. After takes, the rook on f4 would drop. So that's why the pawn cannot be captured. In the game, Karpov pushed the pawn. Now the knight jumped on c6, attacking the queen. Also looking at the e7 square. At some point it can go over there. So let's see what happens. Also, by the way, there is an attack on knight over here. So a lot of things happening at the moment. Queen e1 check was played by Karpov. Bishop f1, defending that. Now we have rook to f5, just defending the knight, also looking at the g5 point. So g6. Again, Kasparov just goes for it. He's just sacrificing pawns left and right. The idea of this is very simple. With pushing the pawn, you have opened up queen's diagonal, and in fact, the queen is looking forward to go on the h6 square, threatening mate here or here, and anything can happen. So this was captured by Karpov. Can you find Kasparov's move here? Well, he plays rook takes g6. If this is captured, there would follow queen h6, followed by a checkmate over here. It cannot be captured. So in the game, Karpov took this pawn, and after takes, we have queen to e1. The queen is looking forward just to get in the game. Now we have rook to g8. King goes over here. There's a check over here. Bishop g3. Basically, after all these exchanges, what we have is a nearly equal position. Yes, black is still up 2 pawns, but being with an exposed king, white is actually holding. He can throw in infinite number of perpetual checks, and after a few moves, the game was agreed as a draw because of the perpetual check. White can keep going and threaten checks. Also, if the queens are exchanged, this pawn is kind of vulnerable because there can follow knight takes a7. So both of the players decided in this position to agree to a draw, and this crazy game was finally rested to a draw. But this left a very powerful impression on all the players and all the people watching the game. None of the players backed down. They were going for it, going for each other's king. And finally, what we have was a very violent display of aggression from Karpov, as well as more from the side of Kasparov, who just went in for this. So many pawn sacrifices. He tried to sacrifice his pawn left and right, and at the end, it was just a peaceful draw. So, hope you enjoyed this game. Game number 3 is gonna come up soon. Thank you for watching, and do subscribe to my YouTube channel. More videos are on the way.